This is The Guardian.
"2022 is in its final days, and it has been yet another turbulent year in US politics. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, an FBI raid on a certain former president's home, the overturning of abortion rights previously enshrined in Roe v. Wade, and just last month, midterm elections that disappointed Republicans and saw Donald Trump branded with the L word, loser. With all that going on, we have certainly not been short of material on this podcast. But what should we expect to happen in Washington, D.C. and beyond in 2023, as the runners and riders begin to jostle for the 2024 presidential contest, and the two main parties confront each other in a newly deadlocked Congress, even as they contend with outside threats like an ongoing global energy crisis. With all that, what do the next 12 months hold for America and its democracy? This week, I bring together two political sages, one Democrat, the other Republican, asking them what they envisage from the new year. I'm Jonathan Freedland, columnist of The Guardian, and this is Politics Weekly America.
You know, once again, the American people were the heroes of this story, and they rose up to prevent MAGA from seizing the kind of power that MAGA wants to have in this country. So I was very pleased and happy.
You might recognize that as the voice of Simon Rosenberg, Democratic strategist, founder of the New Democrat Network, a progressive think tank based in DC. He was mocked in some quarters for prophesying that the Democrats would actually do well on election night in November. He said it right here on this podcast. And yes, Democrats did just lose the House, but as we've been reporting, there were some big blue wins and certainly no red wave.
You know, there was never a red wave. I mean, this was, the first piece that I wrote that this may be an atypical midterm was in October of 2021. I mean, there was plenty of data suggesting that the election I was seeing and that ended up happening was possible. What's distressing to me is that so many important commentators and very smart people got it so wrong. And that's something we're going to have to be working through as we start to go do this next round of political analysis heading into, this next election cycle.
I mean, seeing the repudiation, pretty thorough repudiation in the swing states of so many of these committed election deniers who were handpicked by Donald Trump was just an incredibly important thing to happen. Not just
Sarah Longwell is publisher of The Bulwark, an online meeting place for the anti-Trump Republicans, for those taking a stance against MAGA, Make America Great Again. She's co-founder of the organization Defending Democracy Together and executive director of the Republican Accountability Project.
The only incentive that the Republican Party will have to change will be through sustained electoral defeats. I do focus groups basically every week. Every time we would do a focus group with basically what we characterize as swing voters, so people who had voted for Trump in 2016, but then hadn't voted for Trump in 2020, the fear was that there could be a lot of backsliding. And you saw that in a place like Virginia, where because, they're sort of center right in their disposition, and because they're frustrated with the condition of the country, that they just sort of go back to voting for Republicans, even though they voted against Donald Trump in the last election. But as I was doing the focus groups, I was listening to these swing voters say over and over again, they wanted to vote for Republicans, but they didn't like the individual Republicans that they had to vote for. And so seeing voters reject those extreme candidates is gratifying in terms of where voters are. That voters are looking at these extremes and saying no to them, even when the conditions are really tough, even when they kind of wanted to vote for the other party, they didn't because they rejected extremism. And I just find that at a bleak time politically, or where we'd been feeling sort of bleak in a sustained way, or I certainly have, watching Republicans sort of descend into madness, this was just so good.
Yeah, heartening for you. We're going to be looking ahead to what 2023 might bring, but obviously in the light of what 2022 did bring. And right in the closing weeks, a sort of sting in the tail, I put this to you, Simon, that the Democrats knew that December would bring more news, and it did in the result in Georgia. A race we covered a lot on this podcast. Raphael Warnock seeking re-election against another Trump endorsee in the former athlete Herschel Walker. Warnock did beat him, and people were, getting the champagne out saying that's 51. Now, we did a whole podcast last week on the difference between 51 as opposed to 50, and it's a big difference in controlling the Senate for Democrats. And, the champagne was still, swilling at the bottom of the glass when Kyrsten Sinema announced, senator from Arizona, that she would no longer be calling herself a Democrat, that she would leave the party and from now on be branded as an independent and perhaps, crucial question, even seek re-election as an independent come 2024. Just explain to people who are not sort of immersed in the minutiae of this, whether or not it means Democrats will have, in effect, go back to 50, or does it not mean that? Just explain that to us.
Yeah, I mean, the truth is we don't really know what's going to happen here. But what we do know is that the senator has said she's going to caucus with the Democrats, meaning that she will be still part of the Democratic group the way that Bernie Sanders and I'm forgetting his name
Angus
from Maine,
King from Maine,
King in Maine, are independents but caucus with the Democrats. So the likely scenario is that there's no real significant change. She was always kind of a recalcitrant member of the Democratic family anyway in the last cycle, not always agreeing with the president. So I don't know from a legislative standpoint, particularly because the Republicans control the House, I'm not really convinced it's going to have that much of a difference in what happens in Congress. What happens in the election is still a long way off. And I don't think we know that she will run for re-election. I think this has been a remarkable election for the Democratic Party. And yes, it, like everything in our business, right? It's not perfect and there's setbacks along the way. But as we discussed in October, there was enormous skepticism this was even going to be a close competitive election. But not only did we gain ground in the battlegrounds, pick up a Senate seat, we actually have probably gained 5 state legislative chambers and didn't lose a single state legislative chamber. So a remarkable election all around for us. But we all understand that 2024 is going to be another, battle ahead. But we go into it, I think, feeling strong and confident and not weak and beleaguered and defensive.
In a moment, I'm going to ask you, Sarah Longwell, about the House, which, of course, Republicans took. But just before we leave the Senate, because we've talked about Kyrsten Sinema, that sort of upended some of the arithmetic around 51. The figure of Joe Manchin, the very independent-minded, some would say, some would use other words to describe him, Democratic senator from West Virginia, often very conservative in his politics. Questions to you, Simon, first. Do we see him going the same way as Kyrsten Sinema, perhaps declaring as an independent? At the moment, he was asked that question and he said, I'm going to look at everything. I haven't made up my mind, even about whether seeking re-election. Who knows what the future might bring. But I'm just wondering, does he go back to being incredibly important again, where Joe Biden, the Democrats, cannot get anything through in 2023 unless Joe Manchin gives it his blessing? Because some were hoping that gain of a seat in Pennsylvania would make Joe Manchin, frankly, a bit less important.
Yeah, listen, I don't think there's going to be a lot of legislating in the next 2 years, or at least things that pass both chambers and become signed into law. There's going to be a lot of bills potentially passed or attempted to be passed. I think the real focus in Washington and by the president and the Democratic Party is going to be, finishing the job in Ukraine, making sure that these 3 very important bills that were passed, the infrastructure bill, the CHIPS bill, and the climate bill, are well implemented and we start seeing the effects of these investments on the ground. The government is going to be very busy. The way I think about the next 2 years is that there's 2 big jobs ahead of the government, is to make sure that we're successful in Ukraine, and also that these 3 incredibly important economic investments, bills that invest in our future, are well implemented and people start feeling it on the ground. I think that's going to be a lot of the focus of the Democratic Party.
You've explained there that you can't have much in the way of legislative ambition because it is a divided Congress. Democrats have increased their majority in the Senate, but this brings us to the House, where Democrats lost. We've covered that here, the departure of Nancy Pelosi. Control of the House, Sarah Longwell, is now with Republicans. It's a narrower margin than all the red wave talk prompted some to expect. But now that it's there, how tough will it be for Republicans and for that new speaker, given the slimness, the narrowness of their margin of victory in the House?
Yeah, it sort of can't be overstated how weak Kevin McCarthy is coming into this position of speaker, if he comes in at all. So right now we're watching sort of this chaotic rounds of voting that's going to happen. There's all this behind the scenes wrangling. And what's happening is that the MAGA faction, or even just the hard right faction, is trying to wring concessions out of Kevin McCarthy because they don't trust him. It's funny because for all of Kevin McCarthy's sort of going down to Mar-a-Lago to resurrect Trump, sucking up to Trump, getting Marjorie Taylor Greene to vouch for him. She is one of the people supporting him, which is sort of wild to think about.
She's the quite out there, sort of previously fringe Republican from Georgia, but now slightly less fringe, very right-wing figure, but in a way closer to the heart of things.
Well, because Kevin McCarthy has had to pacify her. She had quit. She rose to stardom as somebody who kind of represented this very MAGA faction. And Kevin McCarthy, I think, felt like in order to clinch the speakership, he was going to need to make nice with her. And so he is committed to committee assignments for her and has put her at the center of, she stands next to him often. She's now quite powerful. And yet for all of those concessions, there is still a hard right faction in the party that believes Kevin McCarthy will do things like work with Democrats to fund the government or whatnot. And so they're going to try to hold out to get more power. But then he's also going to have the sort of more moderates, more sensible people who don't want to spend all their time investigating Hunter Biden or impeaching Mayorkas or those kinds of things. And so it just makes it very difficult for him to govern. And I'll say, you assume it was going to be Kevin McCarthy. And I would still, if I had to bet on it, I would still say it's going to be Kevin McCarthy, but it might not be.
And if it isn't, Sarah, who's the name we should be looking out for?
So it probably ends up being somebody like Steve Scalise. He's just somebody who has maybe a slightly better relationship with some of these hard right guys. I've heard some people, I think Matt Gaetz, say that he was that might be acceptable to him. For a lot of people, they just want a pound of flesh out of McCarthy. They don't want it to be him. Don Bacon of Nebraska, congressman from Nebraska, who is on the sort of more sensible side, has also been threatening. I think this is not going to happen, but he's been sort of threatening, if it's not going to be McCarthy, that he may work with Democrats and bring along some moderate Republicans to have a more moderate speaker. If this thing spins out of control, you could find yourself, this has happened before, to John Boehner, and it just ends. So it's all still very much in flux.
There was a time when people would put outlandish scenarios forward and I would think to myself, no, that's never going to happen. These days, I find myself thinking, whatever's the most outlandish is the one that's most likely to happen. So people should brace themselves anyway for some turbulence. And if there's going to be any activity, it may well take the form of investigations, committee hearings, probing. You mentioned Hunter Biden, the president's son, also Alejandro Mayorkas, the secretary for Homeland Security. So that, that's the kind of activity that we may brace ourselves for. I suppose before we even get to any of that, there is a sort of practical matter about making sure that the government can pay its bills. And there's a deadline looming that if the Congress doesn't get its act together, there will be a government shutdown. Just on that, just talk us through, Sarah, what the politics of that is and how you think that will break.
Well, let me just back up and say one thing, which is that the byproduct of this being such a bad election for Republicans is manifesting in a lot of the Republican leadership who everybody sort of thought was going to be de facto in charge, like Kevin McCarthy, like Mitch McConnell. They're getting challenged. They're getting challenged by these new sort of factions that have built up within the party. Even Mitch McConnell, was sort of briefly challenged. And there is a group of them, Rand Paul and Mike Lee. And these are people who are hardcore on government spending. That's their main issue. And so this is one where the Freedom Caucus types and some of the folks in the Senate, the debt hawks, they will push for concessions in order, and Ted Cruz, Ted Cruz has shut down the government before in order to not raise the debt ceiling. And so this is one of the big fights that there's a certain faction in both the House and Senate. They're going to want to pick this fight, and they're going to want to wrangle concessions out of Democrats around spending in order to raise the debt ceiling. When those talks go poorly, what happens is you wind up, as we've seen happen before, where they just shut the government down, and it goes on for some period of time as they engage in a standoff. And that's a very scary moment because there's so many things like America's credit rating is at stake. There's a lot of big repercussions to doing these things. It's a scary place to play, chicken.
And I suppose one reason why these things keep on happening is the political peril maybe feels a little distant because there's just been elections and there won't be elections again for nearly 2 years. And so perhaps some of those debt hawks and others do feel able to sort of play political games because they won't pay an immediate price for that. As we speak, it does look like they've come up with some kind of
framework,
compromise
yes.
by bipartisan, a framework, yeah. So maybe as we speak, both sides will step back from the brink. Simon, to you, there was a ceremony this week that we saw Joe Biden sign into law the Respect for Marriage Act as a kind of antidote to the 1990s era Defense of Marriage Act, which went out of its way to head off the equal marriage movement and define marriage instead as between a man and a woman. I mean, the importance of this is it says essentially that states have to honour and accept as valid marriage licenses outside that state, even if they are for unions that state might otherwise want to not recognise. And I'm thinking of same-sex marriages, but also incredibly interracial unions. I mean, many listeners to this, I think, will be shocked that this is even a thing. The thinking behind it, we should explain, was partly because of that Roe v. Wade judgment, which I referred to, obviously one of the seismic political events of the year, which said abortion is no longer a constitutionally protected right. Instead, it should be left up to individual states. That led many to fear that actually this same Supreme Court, with its 6-3 conservative majority, might start looking at other rights that had previously been accepted and saying they too could be up to the discretion of the states, and that could mean marriages not being recognized. I'm just wondering if this is a harbinger for 2023, whether are you yourself expecting to see more legislation coming or moves perhaps in the Senate or elsewhere somehow designed to preempt decisions of the Supreme Court?
There's no question that the extremism of the Supreme Court cost the Republicans dearly in this election. There was a rejection of the kind of extremist decisions that were made, Dobbs being the most important one, the ending of Roe v. Wade. There has to be terror inside the political class of Republicans that this extremist court is going to continue issuing decisions. They're going to push the Republican Party further and further away from voters in ways that could potentially do generational harm. If you're a reasonable Republican like Sarah, you can't be encouraged. The great hope, the anti-Trump, Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, came out with an extremist set of statements about vaccines and COVID that have to be disheartening.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, he's now asking the Florida Supreme Court to greenlight an investigation into, and the way he put it, is any and all wrongdoing in Florida with respect to COVID-19 vaccines.
To anyone who believes that he's going to present himself as sort of an alternative to MAGA, it was as deeply MAGA as anything that anybody's done in the last few months. And so I think part of the fundamental dynamic here, one of the things I'm very interested in is seeing if John Roberts now has more ammunition to try to rein in the extremists who dominated the court in this last cycle, and that the court itself, moves away and backs away from sort of this, this extremist course that it's been on. This is really important. And I think certainly we could see, in the next 2 years, if we see 10-year-olds having babies and you see pictures of the babies and the families and everything else, the sort of craziness of what's happened on this issue could end up becoming far more central to our politics than it even was over the last 6 months. And so I think what you're raising here is really important. And it is certainly a central set of questions about what happens with us in the next 2 years.
It is, Sarah, a fascinating thought that actually, in a kind of be careful what you wish for way, that Republicans for 40 years dreamed of having a conservative majority court. They've now got it. And what Simon's suggesting there is it actually could become a burden for Republicans because the court could stake out ever more conservative but also unpopular positions in the country. What's your read of that? And you, as somebody who was and is from that never Trump wing of the party, what do you hear from those around you in the wider Republican family? Is there a moving away from Trump personally, branded as a loser, as I said at the start, or is there a moving away from Trumpism? What kind of reckoning is going on in your party that you can describe for us?
Yeah, let me try to unpack this because there's a bunch of layers to it. So one of the fundamental dynamics is that despite the fact that these extreme election denialists were rejected in many of the contested swing state races, Trump endorsed candidates won all over the place. The incoming class of congressional members as well as state chambers, they are just much more MAGA. The thing that's happening for Republicans, and it's true of the court and it's true of elections, which is that the gap between the more extreme factions of the Republican Party and sort of your average normie Republican who likes lower taxes and limited government, free markets, and I would put myself in that category, that gap has gotten really wide, almost impossible to bridge that gap. And the same thing is happening with the courts. The court has moved much further right, which does not comport with the sort of normie center. People talk about Trump, MAGA, hard right. And it's true in one sense. In another sense, one of the things he had going for him was because he was this kind of thrice married television personality, nobody actually thought of him as a social conservative. They thought of him actually as kind of a cultural moderate. And it helped him to be a cultural moderate with a lot of these sort of secular working class voters who actually...
He even thought of him as a kind of New York liberal.
That's
for his
right.
position on gay rights and on guns.
That's right. He was not a moral crusader. And so a lot of those voters who actually don't kind of like a Mike Pence stance on things, they find him sort of weird. They could relate to Trump in that way. Like I hear from those people all the time. And it's funny, even people who they'll say this line, and the first time I heard it, I sort of chuckled, but then I heard it so many times that I realized this is a deeply embedded sentiment from a lot of older voters, especially women, where they say, look, I'm pro-life, but I believe in a woman's right to choose. Trump's strength emanates from base primary voters, and that base is quite large. It was large enough to essentially give Trump every candidate he wanted in the primary, but then they lost in the general election, and that is a problem for Republicans. It's why you see this internal fighting in the House and the Senate, is because those two factions are getting further and further away from each other.
Just on one quick thing about Trump and his own standing, we are braced for the report of the Select Committee of the House into the January the 6th events of 2021. Could be coming as soon as middle of next week. We're not sure. It could be longer. If they do come up, first of all, do you expect, Sarah Longwell, a verdict that could point the finger particularly at Donald Trump? And if it does it damage him, or is it just yet another thing that bounces off him, particularly with the people you're talking about, that base of Republican primary voters?
Yeah, I think it's going to come out. I think it's going to come out, I think in a slightly unfortunate timing right before Christmas. But I think it's going to be big. I think it's going to have referrals in it to the Department of Justice for indictments. And I think that it's going to be focused pretty squarely on Trump. And I also think, look, you've got an outstanding Georgia potential indictment for him trying to, tell Brad Raffensperger to find those 11,000 votes in Georgia. You've got the Mar-a-Lago documents case. And so he could be under criminal indictment on so many fronts in the coming months. And there's always this question and I genuinely don't know the answer to it, although I guess I could take a stab at it, but is whether or not that hurts or helps Trump. Because one of his superpowers has been that when he is pitted against an institution that a lot of conservatives don't like, for example, the FBI now, because they used to be pro-police, but now they're not, I guess, he sets himself up as a victim and people are sort of forced to take his side against, the deep state that they hate, that creates this sort of rally round Trump effect. And that actually can make him more powerful as opposed to in this moment where I think he's at his political weakest.
You've taken us to the crucial thing, which is obviously a huge part of the politics of 2023 will be the first early rounds of 2024 and people bracing for that election. I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Sarah, on how that plays out, given everything you've just said. But to you first, Simon, a big question before the election among Democrats was, does Joe Biden run again? Lots of people feel that question is pretty settled by the fact that these midterms were, as you predicted, but most didn't, quite good for Democrats. This is my thought. Is Joe Biden safe in a way as long as Donald Trump is the obvious looming opponent on the other side? Clearly, Trump was a presence in the midterms. That's why Democrats did well. Is Joe Biden the guy as long as Trump is around? But if Trump is not around, does Joe Biden suddenly look vulnerable on the Democratic side to a potential challenger saying, look, you're going to be 82 come that election. We need to make way for a new generation of leadership?
Yeah, I mean, my assumption is that Joe Biden runs for re-election. I don't know that that's going to happen, but I think that's sort of what most Democrats feel now. It's certainly the signals the White House is giving. But I think whether he runs or not, what's important about the question you're asking is how are the Democrats going to fare in 2024? We have two opportunities to significantly improve both the brand of the party and Joe Biden's personal brand, which will strengthen everything, which is for us in 2024, which is if we do wound Putin and look like we've been successful in Ukraine in this unified effort with our European and UK partners, and also if the economy feels better in 2 years or a year and a half than it does today, which it is likely to do, we could be much stronger as a party even than we are today, even after this very strong election, regardless of who our nominee is. And so I think when you look at the structural things underneath, regardless of who our candidate is, the Democratic Party is going to be strong going into the next election. Whereas I think the Republicans, as Sarah was discussing, have these millstones around their neck. If we were in a parliamentary democracy, Sarah would be in a different party than Trump right now. There would have been a split between the parties. And it's not really clear, given the distance she's describing, that any politician's capable of uniting the factions now of the Republican Party and being successful. My basic takeaway is, regardless of who our nominee is, I'd rather be us than them as we head into 2024.
Yeah. On that challenge for Republicans and the sort of different factions that Simon's identified, Sarah, what a lot of people have been saying is Trump does well under the Republican system, that kind of winner-takes-all system in those primaries where even if you just get 31%, you can be the winner as long as nobody gets, above 30%. That all requires Republicans to begin to coalesce, certainly in 2023, around not necessarily their first choice, but their first choice to take on Donald Trump. And then it's a head-to-head, and maybe in that situation, Lord Voldemort can be slain. But how do you see that? Do you see your party beginning to see not necessarily who the nominee is for 24, but who the challenger against Donald Trump is? And I suppose I'm bound to ask, is that figure Ron DeSantis?
Yeah, look, when I do the focus groups, I always ask a question. I say, do you want to see Donald Trump run in 2024? And right around the January 6th committee, I saw those numbers take a nosedive. And then I would say, okay, well, if Trump doesn't run, who do you want to see run? And the number one name with a bullet, without any caveats, is Ron DeSantis. The thing, though, about DeSantis is the dynamic of a head-to-head between a Trump understudy and Trump himself is one that is very difficult to predict. I'm not sure Ron DeSantis will do it. I think right now you're much more likely, based on what you're seeing, to see Nikki Haley run and Mike Pence run, maybe Chris Christie, Mike Pompeo, a bunch of kind of also-rans that are not going to excite this sort of new coalition of voters. And that's where I could see Donald Trump pulling it out. I think because Trump got in so early, there's going to be like a two-phase primary. It's going to be different from maybe anything we've seen, where there's kind of an early set of people. After, people get a sense of how Trump is faring with his base, there could be another set of challengers that get in. And then ultimately, there's going to need to be, by primary time, a coalesce. They can't do what they did in 2016, and they know that, which is allow a massive group of people to fracture the vote and give Trump a plurality in his burn it all down lane again.
Well, on the basis of what you said, it means 2023 is in some ways the first phase of that 2024 contest. That winnowing will have to happen then. You've in a way given us a prediction of a kind for 2023, but invidious question to both of you, although Simon, with your track record, you can hardly go wrong. But why don't we just ask both of you for a surprise that we should be bracing for, something that nobody else is talking about or other people would find unexpected, something that you think will be part of the story of 2023. Simon, you first, and then we'll come back to you, Sarah.
God, it's a great question. I think, to me, the biggest surprise of the last few weeks as we project forward is what's happening with Twitter. I don't know what's going to happen with Twitter. It's a major event in our political discourse in the United States. Part of the way I communicated, I had 100 million Twitter views, and between the beginning of October and the beginning of November, it was the primary way that many of us talked to one another in democratic politics. And so I think the biggest surprise now, and I just projected forward, is what's happened with Elon Musk, who has gone from being this enormously admirable, tech titan who's built all these remarkable companies to being, a MAGA lunatic and taking this global platform that was widely used by many global politicians to communicate in English to people around the world and putting it in danger. And so I think that's, to me, at least for now, the biggest surprise.
Sarah?
Yeah, I'm going to build on what I said before and frame it more as a prediction, which is that I think that Ron DeSantis is going to be all the talk for a while. And then I think he is going to maybe like a Jeb Bush or like a Scott Walker. I think he's going to be sort of the fait accompli until he's not. I think it will be somebody else who emerges as the front runner to take on Donald Trump and not DeSantis.
I think this is a good prediction for us to be offering our listeners, if only because at the equivalent stage of the 2008 election cycle, the name on everyone's lips, I think, was Rudy Giuliani. And I think in 2016, at the equivalent stage where we are now in December of 2022, the equivalent stage for 2016, everyone would have been talking about Jeb Bush. And you can ask both of them how their presidencies went because it didn't happen. So you've put down an important marker there, both of you, that not really buying the Ron DeSantis boom, either of you. And as I've said, with your track records, that's a projection at least worth listening to. Simon Rosenberg, Sarah Longwell, thanks so much for joining me for this look back as we look forward to 2023. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is all from me for this week. Now, Politics Weekly America is taking a short break to catch our breath after what has been quite a year. But fear not. For the next 2 weeks, we will be revisiting 2 of our favourite episodes from 2022. Next week, we thought it would be interesting to listen back to my conversation with the journalist John Ronson, who has been studying for years the world of conspiracy theories and the far right. And as part of that, he came across a certain Alex Jones. So listen next Friday to John's take on why Jones got to be the radio host in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. And before I go, I wanted to let you know about The Guardian and Observer's 2022 charity appeal. As the cost of living crisis pushes 14.5 million people below the UK poverty line, more families than ever are facing a bleak Christmas. So please join us as we raise funds for charities working on the front line. All donations will go to Citizens Advice and Locality to help support local grassroots projects, which aim to support those who've been hit hardest. You can find the link to donate on this week's episode page for Politics Weekly America at theguardian.com. But for now, it's goodbye. The producer is Danielle Stevens, the executive producer, Maz Ebtehaj. Thanks, as always, for listening.
This is The Guardian.